started recording. So hello everyone, thanks for joining today's chat with our weekly guests in our weekly live broadcast. This is organized by Nepal Society and Ireland Nepal Chamber of Commerce. We are glad to have two guests today. We just had a chat with Mr. Mike O'Shea, and in our second session we have Dr. Daniel McCartney. He is a researcher in Technological University Dublin. He's a lecturer there, and his background is nutrition, and recently he has done research in and the importance of vitamin D in this COVID-19 pandemic. So I will let Dan to talk about more about what his research is about, and the more importantly, our main focus from this chat is how we can collaborate Dan's research and how we can use his research in Nepal. So I'm expecting a couple of doctors to join here, or if not, what we will do is we will share today's presentations, Dan's presentation with them, and we will be organizing more interactions program later on and see how we can take this forward. So with me today, I have Dr. Patrick O'Sullivan. He's one of the executive committee members of Nepal Society. He has kindly agreed to host this today's program. So I will pass it on to Patrick.
All right, well, thanks very much, Deepesh. I think you've stolen my thunder there. I was going to introduce Daniel, but Dr. McCartney, but I think you've done most of it. Daniel is a professional dietitian and academic with postgraduate training in molecular medicine and public health nutrition. And I think the public health nutrition is the aspect that would be really important in the Nepal situation, where we have still have a fair degree of severe malnutrition fairly commonly in the young children, certainly around weaning age and whatever. And so Dan has led on the research into vitamin D deficiency and the response to COVID, which I think certainly in Europe has been very important, that people can improve their immunity or their resistance to the disease by making sure that their vitamin D levels are adequate. And so I think this talk is going to be really interesting. I mean, there are various aspects of vitamin D that will be relevant, and a lot of children in Nepal would be multivitamin deficient. So, you know, the nutrition problems are a huge issue in Nepal. So this has to be relevant to the way they're responding to COVID out there and dealing, you know. So Dan, I'll hand over to you then, if that's okay.
Thanks so much, Patrick. I'm really delighted to present today. This arose from conversations with Seamus Clandillan and Deepesh a number of months ago in relation to the COVID situation in Nepal, and we had been working on this issue for really over a year at that stage in relation to the Irish problem of vitamin D deficiency and how it was impacting COVID-19 incidence and mortality in this country. So we're really delighted to present here today to the Nepal Ireland Society. And what I'll do is I'll share my screen and I'll pop up my slides and we'll take it from there. So if you're able to see that, can everyone see that okay?
Yeah.
So I'll take you through this. As I say, my name is Dan McCartney. I'm Program Director of the Human Nutrition and Dietetics Program at TU Dublin and Trinity College. And my background is in dietetics, but also in public health, nutrition, and molecular medicine. So I'll begin just by explaining the history of this evidence about vitamin D and COVID and how that evolved over the last year or so. Before we ever knew COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 infection, we already knew that people that had low vitamin D levels were more likely to get respiratory infections, sometimes serious respiratory infections. And we also had a lot of data there, most notably from Adrian Martineau in London, that showed us that people that took vitamin D supplements were protected against these respiratory infections. Very early in the pandemic as well, we began to realize that the groups that were most severely affected by COVID-19 coincided almost exactly with the groups that were most likely to be vitamin D deficient. So you can see some of them listed there: people that were carrying extra weight, people with darker skin, and then older adults, obviously, as well, and people with pre-existing disease. So that was very interesting. We also knew from a clinical perspective that the immunophenotype that characterized people with severe COVID-19 disease had a very significant overlap with that which you would expect to see in vitamin D deficiency. For example, the inflammatory markers, particularly IL-6, but also TNF-alpha, were very high in these severe COVID-19 cases, and they seem to have a disruption to their interferon gamma response that compromised their adaptive immune response to the infection, most notably their ability to produce antibody successfully. So we saw this very aggressive Th1 immune response, this cytokine storm that we've become familiar with over the last number of months. And we know that vitamin D is a feature of this pro-inflammatory state that predisposes to the cytokine storm. Thrombophilia, or clotting, is also a key feature of severe COVID-19 disease, and we know that people that are vitamin D deficient are more likely to clot pathologically. So there was strong suggestive evidence right from the outset that vitamin D might be a causal factor in severe COVID-19 disease. My colleague and friend Declan Byrne and I published this paper in the Irish Medical Journal at the beginning of April 2020. And in it, we suggested this causal role for vitamin D deficiency as a risk factor for not just COVID-19 infection or SARS-CoV-2 infection, but also for severe disease. And we proposed that the Irish population should be supplemented at doses of vitamin D that were higher than those currently recommended. Now, the same day that we published that, Roseanne Kenny, who's the professor of geriatric medicine in St. James's Hospital and lead or principal investigator of the TILDA study, published this report examining the role of vitamin D in COVID-19 among older Irish adults, and arriving at many of the same conclusions that we had, that this was a causal factor in increasing risk if people had low vitamin D levels. Around the same time, we began to see these geographic and ecological studies start to emerge. Now, these are relatively crude, but what they showed us was that COVID-19 severity in terms of mortality and SARS-CoV-2 incidence all increased as you moved away from the equator. But more than that, they showed us that countries that had confirmed low vitamin D status had much higher incidence of SARS-CoV-2 infection and had much higher mortality rates. The last of these studies is really interesting. It's one from November last year. And as the diagram shows here, this is really plotting the surge of COVID-19 cases across the Northern Hemisphere last autumn to winter. And you can see that in all of these individual countries, the beginning of that surge of cases coincided almost to the day with the time in which those individual countries dipped below 34% of the UVB exposure experienced at the equator. So once the sunlight began to dissipate, and once we began to get into winter, repeatedly across regions and across countries, the incidence of SARS-CoV-2 infection went up. We also have direct evidence from a number of observational clinical studies from the April 2020 onwards. The first of them there from Switzerland was a study that showed levels of vitamin D of about 27 nanomoles per liter in those who were infected versus average levels of 61 nanomoles per liter in those who weren't. The Meltzer study from Chicago showed a 77% increased risk of vitamin D, or of SARS-CoV-2 positivity rather, in people that were vitamin D deficient. And then the Kaufman study at the end there, this was a really large study, 192,000 people across the US. And what they showed was that for people that had vitamin D levels less than 50 nanomoles per liter, they were about twice as likely to become infected with the SARS-CoV-2 virus as those who achieved levels more than 137 nanomoles per liter. There are meta-analyses in these areas as well. So if we look at the meta-analyses describing risk of infection, we see that the first study here, this is a compilation of 10 studies or data from 10 studies, and we see a roughly 40 to 45% increased risk of SARS-CoV-2 positivity in those with blood levels of vitamin D less than 73 nanomoles per liter. There's a further meta-analysis by Kazemi and colleagues from March this year that shows something similar, except that the odds ratio is increased. So roughly 75% increased risk of SARS-CoV-2 infection in the vitamin D deficient state. And then this most recent of all of the meta-analyses by Gassamayan and colleagues shows that increased risk of SARS-CoV-2 infection is about 3.3-fold for those that have low vitamin D levels. So the take-home message here is that if you have low vitamin D levels, you're more likely, significantly more likely to become infected with SARS-CoV-2. There were also, in terms of disease severity, quite a lot of data that began to emerge that showed us that people with low vitamin D levels were more likely to have severe disease. So Frank Leo did work over in the US, and it's very early on in the pandemic, and he showed that his ICU admission patients had much lower levels of vitamin D than those who remained on the ward. John Fall, our colleague and friend from Blanchardstown Hospital, was doing work very early on this, around April or May. Now, if you speak to John about this, he really wasn't looking, although his background interest is in vitamin D, he's an asthma specialist really, with an interest in vitamin D, but he hadn't necessarily been looking for vitamin D as an a priori assumption that it would be low in his COVID-19 patients. So they looked at everything. They were looking at all of these different biometric parameters. And he was so struck by the fact that these COVID-19 patients had such low vitamin D levels that he also published in the Irish Medical Journal in May 2020. And he showed that for people that had low vitamin D levels, less than 30 nanomoles per liter, they were about 3.2 times more likely to require intubation. Radakovich is a study from Germany, and again, it showed really clearly that people that had low vitamin D levels, less than 30 nanomoles per liter, they were about 6 times more likely to require invasive mechanical ventilation, and they were also 14 to 15 times more likely to die as COVID-19 inpatients than people that were vitamin D replete. So a lot of observational data there in terms of individual studies. There are also meta-analyses here. One of them is the Kazemi study that I mentioned earlier. They also examined disease severity. And they found that in the adjusted studies, after all the various confounders had been adjusted for, 2.6-fold increased risk of severe disease in people that were vitamin D deplete. And they also found a roughly 2.5-fold increased risk of mortality in people that were vitamin D deplete. The Gassamayan study also identified a 5-fold increased risk of severe COVID-19 disease in people with low vitamin D levels. And you can see there the most recent one from August this year from Ben Altriki and colleagues among about 3,500 patients identified a relative risk of death of about 1.6 and a relative risk of developing COVID-19 pneumonia of about 1.5. So really, really compelling data there. I should say, I mentioned John Fall earlier. we have worked with John over the last number of months on data that have been developed there in Blanchardstown Hospital. What we've seen is that for those Irish COVID-19 patients, if they have low vitamin D levels less than 30 nanomoles per litre, even after adjusting for confounders including obesity, diabetes, and age, those people are 4.6 times more likely to die of their COVID-19 infection than people that have vitamin D levels over that 30 nanomole per litre threshold. So we're publishing that shortly. Of course, these are associative relationships. You can't necessarily infer that the relationship is causal just looking at these associative data. However, there are intervention studies now that show us that vitamin D supplementation is important in mitigating this risk of severe outcome in COVID-19. The best known of them is the second one here from Castillo and colleagues in Spain. And this was a small study, pilot, of 76 consecutive COVID-19 admissions. So 50 of those admissions received 3 doses of activated vitamin D, calcifediol, in relatively large doses over the first week of their admission. And the other 26 patients didn't get any. Of the 50 patients that were given the activated vitamin D, 1 of them ended up in ICU and recovered quickly. Of the 26 patients who did not get the activated vitamin D, 13 of them ended up in ICU, and unfortunately, 2 of them died. So statistically, even for a small sample population like that, the signal is strong. It equates to a relative risk of ICU admission of about 30 to 35-fold lower. So 30-fold reduced risk of ending up in ICU with the activated vitamin D. The Anweiler study from France, again, showed lower mortality, much lower mortality in COVID-19, older nursing home COVID-19 patients that were given vitamin D in high dose, bolus doses around the time of their diagnosis. At 5 weeks follow-up, about 44% of the unsupplemented population were still alive, whereas with the ones that received vitamin D in these sort of high bolus doses, 83% of them survived at 5 weeks. So an almost 2-fold difference. The English study there from Manchester and Leicester and Preston, this was a multi-center study, and they actually performed it twice. The first study identified a 7 to 8-fold reduced risk of mortality in people that received high-dose vitamin D during their hospital admission. So they repeated that study and they adjusted for an even more extensive list of confounders, and they still found a 2.5-fold reduced risk of mortality in the people that received those high-dose vitamin D supplements early in their admission. Again, there are meta-analyses here. The first one is a preprint that we need to be a little bit careful of in terms of, it's not published in the peer-reviewed literature. But you can see there's a clear difference in the vitamin D supplementation groups or intervention groups as opposed to the non-intervention groups. About 10% of the supplemented groups don't survive, whereas for the control groups, it was more like a quarter of those that had died. In terms of other outcomes, we see here a more recent study, a meta-analysis from Haryanto and colleagues. ICU admission, about 4 times lower. Mechanical ventilation, about 3 times lower. And mortality, about 3 times lower in those who take vitamin D supplements. And again, further study by Pal and colleagues showed very significant reduction, about 2.5-fold reduced risk of ICU admission and about a 4-fold reduced risk of overall adverse outcomes in patients receiving vitamin D. This is what happened when they started to supplement the vulnerable older population in Andalusia, Spain. Andalusia is a territory of about 8 million people, and they were having really significant mortality rates last November. At the beginning of November, they were losing about 70 to 75 people per day from COVID-19, mainly in their older age groups. And the health authorities there decided that they would start to supplement these vulnerable older adults with the activated form of vitamin D, the calcifediol that was used in the Cordoba study. And you can see very clearly there in the graph that the mortality rates plummeted. So they went from about 70 per day in early to mid-November, right down to about 3 per day in early January. And that's really conspicuous because right across the Northern Hemisphere, at exactly the same time, the COVID-19 incidence and mortality rates were absolutely exploding, whereas they were going in reverse in Andalusia. This is a repository, the vitamin D, C19vitamindi.com repository, where a lot of the data, research data and research papers are curated here. And it's really useful because they do periodic meta-analysis to try and ascertain, on a, from an overview perspective, what are the data actually telling us with each of these new studies that's published. We also have laboratory studies that explain some of the mechanisms by which vitamin D might mediate its positive effect. The first of these studies from Mock and colleagues was really interesting. They took about 2,000 different bioactive compounds here, and they examined their role in suppressing SARS-CoV-2 viral replication in cultured nasal epithelial cells. And ultimately, they came down to about 7 candidate compounds that they thought were going to be useful here. And the one that came out most effective in terms of the suppression of viral replication was vitamin D. So we published as our consortium last November 2021 a position statement that described all of these mechanisms by which optimal vitamin D status suppressed COVID-19 risk. And you can see here that these relate both to resistance to infection and also to suppression of this very aggressive immune response that can lead to catastrophic outcomes in COVID-19. So, for example, we see that the renin-angiotensin system is moderated or suppressed by vitamin D, as is the kinin kallikrein system. And in simple terms, that means less inflammation and less likelihood of clotting. But you can see that there are direct effects here on vitamin D on both the innate and the adaptive immune systems that predispose to a gentler, less aggressive immune response and a more effective immune response in terms of viral clearance. One of the really interesting things here is that, of course, vitamin D binds to vitamin D binding protein. And we think that that's important as well, because when vitamin D binding protein is free and able to bind to other moieties, this can cause problems. It's a sort of promiscuous protein that binds, for example, to actin globular proteins that are liberated during tissue damage. And when it does that, those actin vitamin D binding protein complexes drive inflammation forward. So vitamin D, in sequestering that, that vitamin D binding protein prevents that from happening. Since we published this work, I mean, there have been lots of people that have called for randomized control trials to establish with definitive certainty that vitamin D is causally related to COVID-19 severity before we move to supplement people. In my view, that's an entirely inappropriate response, given the scale and magnitude of the crisis that we're facing, not just here in Ireland, but internationally. Vitamin D intervention trials, notwithstanding the data that we've reviewed, are very difficult to conduct from a methodological perspective. They're also very costly because you require large numbers. There's lots of confounders, for example, sunlight, dietary intake, and they take a long time to do. We don't have that time. We don't have the luxury of time before we intervene with this. I would put it that these randomized control trials are also completely unnecessary. If you look at the Bradford Hill criteria that underpin other public health interventions, like smoking cessation, we've never had a randomized control trial to tell us that smoking was bad for people that it caused lung disease. So it's not appropriate to do that. But these various criteria that are used in evaluating the smoking cessation interventions are just as valid in their application to the vitamin D COVID story. For example, we know from background studies, as we said at the beginning of this talk, that vitamin D deficiency is already associated with increased risk of respiratory infection. So why would COVID-19 be any different? We also know that there's a biological gradient, and that has been borne out by the data that have emerged over the last 12 to 18 months, where we see, as we look at our most deplete vitamin D patients, they're the ones that get really severe disease and die. And as your vitamin D status begins to improve across that spectrum, you go from mortality to severe infection and hospitalization, to less severe hospitalization where people aren't in the ICU, to less severe infection where people don't get admitted to hospital, right up to asymptomatic infection. So there is a spectrum of severity that coincides in an inverse relationship with the spectrum of vitamin D status. The better your vitamin D status, the less severe your outcome in terms of SARS-CoV-2 infection. This is the scale of the problem in the Nepalese population. We know that about 60% of young mothers have levels less than the critical 50 nanomole per liter threshold that's required to improve immunity against COVID-19. And we know that about 1 in 7 of these young mothers have levels less than 30 nanomoles per liter. So that's the really risky threshold below which your risk substantially increases of having a very adverse outcome from COVID-19. You can see here that about a quarter of adults seem to have levels less than 25 nanomoles per liter. So this is the general adult population in these areas of Pokhara and Chitwan. And I mean, that's a really low level. Again, that puts them in imminent danger of severe outcome of COVID-19. There's some other studies there with psychiatric patients, with children, rural children. We see that those aged 1 to 5, about 90% of them have levels less than the 50 nanomole per liter threshold required to improve immunological resistance against COVID-19. And very interestingly, there is a study from 2016 or 17, I think, that shows us that 25-OHD levels less than 50 nanomoles per liter result in poor outcome in Nepalese children with pneumonia. So there are already data there that shows that not only is vitamin D deficiency a problem in Nepal, but also that the children, at least, that are affected by this have worse outcomes in terms of the respiratory infections. The next question is supplementation safe? And we know from European Food Safety Authority, we know that the Institute of Medicine in America, and we know that the Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition in the UK are all concurrent that oral intakes of less than 100 micrograms per day do not cause a threat to human health in adults. So you can take up to 100 micrograms per day consistently, and it's not going to cause a health problem. There are some conditions like sarcoidosis or TB or lymphoma, some granulomatous conditions where vitamin D activation is increased in the body. And obviously in those instances, you need to be careful. But they're a small minority of the overall adult population. So the reason that we're talking about supplementation is really because of the inability to get sufficient vitamin D levels from food. If we look at the Irish population, we consume about 3 to 5 micrograms per day from food in this country. If you contrast that with the amount of vitamin D that you generate from sunlight, if you go out on a sunny day in this country, expose your skin to sunlight in midsummer, you might generate about 120 to 150 micrograms of vitamin D. So diet or dietary intake has always been a very minor contributor to our physiological requirements of vitamin D. The problem for Irish adults, and I suspect for Nepalese adults and children as well, is that we've all moved indoors. So we don't make vitamin D in our skin anymore because we're not exposing our skin to sunlight often enough. Or when we do, we often use sunblock rather, or these UVB protectants. So this is a big problem. Vitamin D nutrition across the world is compromised because we're not getting this sunlight exposure. Generally, blood levels rise by about 0.7 nanomoles per liter for each additional microgram we take. So if you look at your data there from Nepal, and you say, well, okay, for those 26% of the adult population that have levels less than 25 nanomoles per liter, if you were to supplement them with 10 micrograms per day, you might see that their levels went up by about 7 nanomoles per liter. It's not going to get them anywhere near that 50 nanomole per liter threshold that they really need to achieve to enhance their immune response. So this is why our recommendations, as put forward in our position paper, recommend that for the Irish population of adults, we should be looking at supplementation doses of about 20 to 25 micrograms per day. Those are the kind of doses that can get Irish adults above that critical 50 nanomole per liter threshold. However, if we examine the Nepalese population, because of their darker skin, which means that they don't synthesize vitamin D as efficiently on exposure to sunlight, it's quite likely that they will require higher doses to achieve optimal levels of serum vitamin D. In terms of opportunistic intervention here, who do we give this to? Well, it makes perfect sense, I think, to be giving vitamin D to people that are attending for COVID-19 tests. It's going to be a significant proportion of them that are vitamin D deficient, and there's also going to be a significant proportion of them that are SARS-CoV-2 positive. So what better time to intervene than early when they're having their COVID-19 tests done? We think hospital inpatients should be another target group. Anyone working indoors or doing shift work where they don't see a lot of sunlight exposure. We also think that magnesium co-supplementation is a good idea here too, because there are significant enough proportion of the population that have suboptimal magnesium levels. And magnesium is a cofactor that allows us to activate vitamin D. So even if you have good vitamin D status, if your magnesium status is lousy, you're probably not going to get the immunological benefit of that. I'll just finish by an overview looking at the imperative to act here. This is a global lethal pandemic. There's been more than 750,000 cases of SARS-CoV-2 positivity in Nepal, documented cases, and over 11,000 lives lost. It's likely that particularly in the context of those cases, that these are significant underestimations. It's a population that, because of their darker skin pigmentation, is highly vulnerable to vitamin D deficiency, because that compromises the major physiological source of vitamin D generation.
Hey Daniel, just to interview there. So we are finally able to go live. So this is now live on the Ireland Nepal Chamber of Commerce Facebook page, and we'll be sharing on Nepal Iron Society Facebook page as well.
Great.
Please continue.
Thanks, Deepesh. So, I mean, in summation, we have nothing to lose here other than the very modest cost of vitamin D supplementation, and everything to gain by initiating population supplementation at these appropriate doses to address the issue of endemic vitamin D deficiency. Just finish by thanking my colleagues in the COVID-D consortium, John and Declan I mentioned earlier, but this is a consortium of 10 of us who've been examining this area for about 18 months at this stage, and have been bringing forward these data. So I'm delighted to be working with them. It's been a great pleasure and privilege. And I'll leave you with this thought from Mike Ryan, who's the Executive Director of WHO's response to this COVID pandemic. Happy to take any questions that people might have.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Dan. That's well, a very good presentation and very thought-provoking. I guess my initial thought was it was counterintuitive vitamin D deficiency in a tropical area, well, you know, where there might be a lot of sunlight. And you said that because of the dark skin that they weren't able to produce the vitamin in their skin, I suppose, to the degree you might expect. Because those figures you had of the levels in different Nepalese population patient groups and things were just very interesting. I would have presumed they would be higher than that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things at work there, Patrick. You know, it's not just the fact that there's, you know, the indigenous population have this darker skin pigmentation. It's also, I think, the fact that we've all moved indoors. And this is a problem across the globe. So one of the things that we observe in Europe, for example, when we look at countries like Italy and Spain, people, you know, intuitively would say, well, Italy and Spain have good vitamin D status. They have lousy vitamin D status.
Yeah.
They're very sunny countries. And when the sun does shine, it gets very, very hot. And so at the time when they would make most vitamin D, they all go indoors and they stay indoors to protect themselves against the sun. Now, there may be different reasons for this in other sunnier climes or warmer countries around the world, particularly countries where there's a lot in terms of industrial development, there's a lot of manufacturing. People work long shifts in factories and they're not getting sunlight exposure at all. One of the things that we notice and that you'll be aware of, for example, is that the population, or one of the population groups in Ireland that was most hard hit by COVID-19 were the people that were working in meat processing factories.
Yeah.
So these are people, again, with darker skin pigmentation, people that are working long shifts where they don't get sunlight exposure, and that are also working in an environment where the ambient conditions propagate the spread of the virus.
Yeah, well, that's very interesting. Yeah, no, I know there have been a number of very large outbreaks in meat, and I presumed it was due to the proximity that they were working within, but you are right. That's hugely interesting, I think, because, as I say, intuitively, you would assume that the vitamin D levels would be all right. Certainly, I worked in Nepal, and one of the confounders to this idea would be vitamin A, because you know, I mean, certainly there is a very good supplementation program in Nepal now for vitamin A, and 86% of children receive supplements of vitamin A. But vitamin A deficiency, or severe vitamin A deficiency, is associated with keratomalacia, eye problems. But it also increases your risk of severe respiratory tract infections and death from the respiratory tract infection. So were there any issues around confounding in your studies, do you think?
Yeah, I'm not really sure about that. I mean, these are studies, again, I mean, in vitamin D studies, there are major confounders like dietary intake, like sunlight exposure, geographical variation, that are probably bigger players in terms of vitamin D status. And this will be more fine tuning. So you don't typically see reference to vitamin A at all in any of these vitamin D studies. And I do recognize that vitamin A is a potential risk factor for respiratory disease. What we know from the population, certainly the Irish population, who we're examining some of these things, is that they tend to be replete in vitamin A. And that's not just necessarily because they have good intakes of retinol in the diet. There is a proportion of the population that miss out on their retinol requirements, 700 or 800 micrograms per day. But usually it's made up by beta carotene. They convert beta carotene into activated vitamin A if there's any shortfall. So we don't really have a big issue with vitamin A deficiency in this population, and that tends to be the same across the developed countries of the world, where a lot of this vitamin D research has been undertaken. Most of it's been done in the US. There's been some done in Europe and the UK as well. But outside those jurisdictions, we haven't seen a lot of this, which is a pity, because I think you're right in your overall premise that this isn't necessarily directly translatable. You know, the sunlight conditions, the dietary intakes, and supplementation practices that might prevail in Ireland obviously be very different from those that might prevail in Nepal or in India, or, you know, any of these other countries around the world.
Well, they have a very good supplementation program according to UNICEF, and certainly when I was there, we were giving supplements to any children we came into contact with, because we presumed the issue was around the weaning time, when they're just fed on what is ground rice, so there's nothing in it at all really in terms of vitamin A, and there's very little vegetable consumed over that weaning period. So that's the most dangerous period for the children, but they become then chronically deficient in vitamin A, and they never regain that. But I mean, it's a bit of a sidetrack. I'm sorry, from your excellent work on vitamin D.
It's very valid. We did a launch for the Irish Gerontological Society there on Thursday, and my task there was not just to talk about vitamin D, but also to talk about the other nutrients that compromise immune function in older adults. And there are big problems there with a lot of those, you know, zinc, magnesium, selenium, vitamin A, well, not so much vitamin A, I suppose, in our Irish population, vitamin C. So there are a spectrum of nutrients that are sort of quite suspect in terms of intakes and status across the older Irish population, all of which can have an effect on both innate and adaptive immunity. But vitamin D, I mean, I described it on the day, this is the low-hanging fruit. This is the one where we know intakes are lousy. We know status is lousy in terms of people's blood levels, and we know that you cannot get enough of this from diet. It's never been the major source. So this, even though there are other problems, this is the one that we really know we need to work on.
And those meta-analyses of outcomes and the Andalusian figures of following the supplementation, they all, I would think, are very strong evidence supporting this hypothesis. I don't know, are there any other questions from anyone who's...
Sorry, thanks, Daniel. Thanks, Patrick. So one question I have, so the supplements that you mentioned, for one way would be to take tablets. I think there's other liquid form of supplements as well. So just on the nutrition point of view, like the food wise, what do you suggest, like what sort of food one should take in on a daily basis to basically increase this vitamin D level in the body?
Yeah, it depends which ones are available. Like one of the good sources of vitamin D in Ireland would be fortified cereals and fortified milks, but they're not available in every country around the world. The natural sources would include things like oily fish. We also fortify or tend to fortify margarines in Ireland with vitamin D. Again, that's not done around the world. So there aren't that many good sources, rich sources of vitamin D. But even with those sources, I mean, this came up on Thursday as well. The implication isn't really that you can meet sufficient intakes for optimal levels. There was an interesting study done in Scandinavia a few years ago. They tried to establish if we get these adults to take oily fish, the richest source or one of the richest sources of vitamin D, 5 days a week, is that going to stop their vitamin D levels dropping over the winter period? And the answer was no, it didn't. So they didn't drop by quite as much, but even taking what you would consider to be a fairly extreme measure of having these oily fish for dinner 5 days a week, it wasn't moving the dial in terms of adequacy. And indeed, it may introduce other hazards in terms of nutritional intake, because if you're taking all this oily fish, maybe you're pushing your red meat out of the diet and compromising your iron or B12 intakes. So pragmatically speaking, I mean, for me as a dietitian, this makes things really simple, because for most things, there's a little bit of ambiguity. We'd say, well, if you do this with the diet, or if you start to eat these different foods, you'll do better. But I'm always unequivocal about this. No matter what you're eating in terms of vitamin D intake, you still need to be supplementing, and supplementing in fairly significant doses if you're in any of those at-risk groups.
So another thing is the sunlight, which is obviously not much that we have here. Now, if you compare the situation in Nepal, so we have adequate sunlight in Nepal, winter, summer, so you at least get a couple of hours of good sunlight. So do we have any study like if you stay in the sun for this many hours a day, and that should suffice for your vitamin D intake?
There's a lot of work that was done by a guy called Robert Heaney, who was, he was an aficionado in this area. He's died since. He worked in Omaha, Nebraska, and he did a lot of modeling about the type of sunlight exposure that was required to elevate blood vitamin D levels. There's a paper that he did with Barger Lux, I think was the name of the author, in 2002. And they estimated that if adults were exposing their skin, most of their skin surface, to summer sunlight, that they would make somewhere between 120 to 170 micrograms of vitamin D from that. Mike Hollick has done some work here as well. But I mean, the real fundamental take-home message here is that you make multiples in terms of the vitamin D synthesis. You make multiples from skin exposure of what you will get from diet. If you're taking a typical diet, in Ireland at least, you might get 3, 4, 5 micrograms per day. Go out in the sun, you're probably going to make 150 micrograms.
Yeah.
But the problems, as I say, that exist, lots of people are indoors, don't get that sunlight exposure. When we do go out, we use UV sunblock, these sort of creams that we put in our skin. And the other thing, of course, is clothing. If you were to look in the Middle East at vitamin D levels, again, one of the sunniest places in the world, and you would say they'll have no problem with vitamin D. They have really, really significant deficits in terms of vitamin D status because they dress in the way that they do and cover the skin so that they don't expose the skin to sunshine.
Okay. So for children, especially toddlers like 3 years old or 4 years old, so to increase the vitamin D levels, what do you suggest? I mean, I don't think giving them supplements would be a good thing at this age. So food-wise, intake, so what is the general guidance there?
The guidance actually in Ireland is for these children to be supplemented. So for children that are 0 to 12 months old in Ireland, the Food Safety Authority of Ireland recommend that they get 5 micrograms per day given as drops. And they've recently updated guidance for the 1 to 5 year olds in this country as well, where they recommend that they should also get a 5 microgram supplement per day. The question as to whether those doses are adequate is I think an open one. They're very significantly lower than the tolerable upper intake for children that's quoted by the European Food Safety Authority. And indeed, the doses that are recommended for young children in America in terms of supplementation are higher than that. So, I mean, there probably isn't a great issue with supplementing at 10 micrograms per day for children. If you look at the international context here, there are some countries that already recommend that.
Okay. Okay, so in the older age, for example, 80 plus, so what is the vitamin D level? The beyond that, you should be taking the supplements. Is it a 50 nml you said earlier?
For which age group?
80 plus. 80 plus.
18 plus.
No,
Adults?
80, old age.
8-year-olds. 8-year-olds. Yeah, I mean, into adolescence.
Yeah, 81 actually. Let's say 81 to 85 years old.
Okay, so these older adults.
Older population, yeah.
Yeah.
80 plus or 75 plus.
Yeah. I think that in those sort of older adults, there are so many of them that are profoundly deficient. When we looked at our data from Galway that Paula O'Shea and Tomas Griffin generated in 2020, there were about a third of the nursing home residents in that study that had levels less than 25 nanomoles per liter.
Nanomoles, all right.
Okay, so that's a really low blood level of vitamin D. So those people need to take supplements if they're wanting to get beyond that 50 nanomole per liter threshold where their immunity is improved. They need to be taking 30, 40, 50 micrograms per day.
Okay.
Okay, so 2,000 international units to get them above the threshold for adequacy. For other populations, you know, younger, old adults that are more ambulatory, that are out in sunlight, walking around, and that are taking a reasonable intake from diet, they may only require 25 micrograms per day. But I would be starting at a floor of 25 micrograms per day for older adults. I think that that's probably the minimum that they should be taking.
So that is basically to reach the 50 nanomole requirement.
Yes.
Threshold.
Yeah.
Okay.
But if you're in a risk category, if you've got darker skin, if you're carrying extra weight, we know, for example, that people that are overweight, so if you've got a BMI of 25 to 30, moderately overweight, you probably require about 1.5 times the dose of vitamin D that someone of ideal weight needs to achieve the same rise in blood levels. If you're obese, if you've got a BMI over 30, you need to triple the dose to achieve the same effect on blood levels.
Right. So 50 nanomole is the threshold. So as soon as if you are less than 50 nanomole, so that's a must-have. Supplement is definitely required. So let's say if you are beyond 50 nanomoles, let's say 55 nanomole, do you still need supplement?
Yes, you should keep on taking it because, you know, particularly this time of year, vitamin D levels are going to drop naturally over the winter period. So you need to keep on taking it on an ongoing basis. And actually, it's a really good question, Deepesh. Some of the studies that are done in this area, they give bolus doses. I mentioned some of them that have positive outcomes, but generally, it seems to be more effective to take a vitamin D supplement at a moderate dose, maybe 25 micrograms per day, and do that every day, than it is to take a vitamin D supplement, a big bolus dose of vitamin D that might be given once a month or once every 3 months. It's more effective to do it on a daily basis.
Daily basis is more effective.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So I have a couple more questions. So before that, let's see if we have questions from our audience here. Dr. Soni Shrestha from UK. I'm just wondering, do you have any questions for Dr. Daniel McCartney?
Thank you, Devesh, sir. Thank you, Dr. McCartney. My video is not on. I don't know why.
Hang on a second. Let's see. Could you turn on your video, please?
Okay, so that's cute. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you. Firstly, I would like to say thank you so much, Dr. McCartney, for your wonderful work. I am working as a GP general practitioner in the UK. Yep. And as being a GP, of course, the nutritional deficiency is a big problem at the moment. The worst part is we are seeing that people are, yes, we know that underweight people do have a nutritional deficiency, but now the big problem is overweight people. People are overweight, but still there is a nutritional deficiency. I think it's a global problem at the moment. The one question I would like to ask, I think the most of the question you have already asked, you have already explained on your presentation. The one question, of course, as a, being a clinician, if there is a severe deficiency, we prescribe vitamin D. But if there is a maintenance dose, we said, buy over the counter, you can buy from the shop. But is there any difference from any particular brand, or is there anything, does it make any difference? Because there is a cost variation depending upon the brand. Is there any difference, any particular brand we should advise, or they can get anything no matter the price?
Yeah, no, the most important thing here is that you get vitamin D3 rather than vitamin D2. Vitamin D3 is much more potent, so it has a better effect in terms of its impact on blood levels. So D3 rather than D2. There aren't really particular brands that you would necessarily recommend one over the other. One of the useful things that you can do, though, is to take your vitamin D supplement with a fat-containing meal. So for most people, that would be either their lunch or dinner, because it's a fat-soluble vitamin, and that will help it to be absorbed if you have fat in the meal that it's consumed with. But in terms of the brands, there isn't really. I get mine in Boots because they do a 3-for-2 offer. Yeah. So, and it seems to be a reasonable price, and it's a good formulation. It's interesting, Sonny, that you talk about the impact of deficiency and the prevalence of deficiency in the GP attending population that you're dealing with clinically. One of the things that we should be aware of both in the UK and Ireland is the very high prevalence of vitamin D deficiency in immigrant populations that have come from other countries. We really did our first study in this area in Ireland. It was just published over the last 6 months by our colleagues Eamon Laird and JB Walsh. And the prevalence of deficiency among the population, these were East Asian immigrants. So a lot of them were of Indian ethnicity, but living in Dublin. And 93% of them had levels less than 50 nanomoles per litre. And there was profound deficiency in a very sizable proportion of them. So this is a really, really big problem for immigrant populations in Ireland and the UK and across other Northern European countries that really needs to be addressed and hasn't been to date.
And one more thing I would like to clarify, as per your study says, when we check the level, I mean, there is I think that the view we have seen for vitamin D is significantly changed comparing to past few years, isn't it? Because important is we are learning still. There's a lot to do with the vitamin D, skin health, mental health. There is quite a lot to do with vitamin D. The one thing, obviously, when we check the level, when there is a more than 50 or 30 level, we said it's a normal or the adequate stage. But as per your studies, it says maintaining on the higher normal side is better than maintaining on the lower normal side from the infection perspective. Is that right? Am I right saying that, Dr. McCartney?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so the 50 nanomole per litre threshold is really a pragmatic threshold where we think this will be achievable with reasonable supplementation. There are a lot of these studies, particularly the later studies, that show us that if you get above 75 nanomoles per litre, and there's quite a few studies now from Israel and from the US, that particularly that Kaufman study, the big one from the US, that those tell us that if you get above 75 nanomoles per litre, and indeed if you get above 100 nanomoles per litre, that you may do even better in terms of your resistance to infection or in terms of reduced risk of severe disease. I mean, we need to think about this in context as well. Bob Heaney, that I mentioned before, published a very interesting paper about 15 or 20 years ago, where he compared human vitamin D levels as they prevail now in most industrialized countries around the world to non-human primates. And the non-human primates, your lowland gorillas, your orangutans, they all have vitamin D levels that are about 100 to 125 nanomoles per litre. So that's physiologically probably where we should be at. But of course, you know, human evolution has conditioned us that we're inside. We don't expose our skin in the way that we do, or that we did before. And as a result of that, you know, in evolutionary terms, our vitamin D level has been compromised for a long time, but particularly over the last 30 or 40 years as work indoors has really proliferated across the globe. So yes, there is, I think, undoubtedly additional benefit to be derived if you get above a vitamin D level, 25 OHD level of 75 nanomoles per liter. The level, the threshold for toxicity that's usually quoted is 125 nanomoles per liter. That's a fairly conservative threshold in reality. If you speak with Professor Walsh, who has done some of the work on this big cohort in Dublin, there's 35 or 36,000 patients in their cohort. They had, I think, so 23 patients with blood levels over 250 nanomoles per liter. Not one of them had hypercalcemia, none of them. So this idea that, you know, you're going to encounter problems with calcium metabolism or hypercalcemia or hypercalciuria as soon as you get a vitamin D level over 100 nanomoles per liter, it's not the case. It's not borne out by the data.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks.
That's good. Thanks, Dr. Soni. So we have Austin McCartney and Yogendra Mansakya. Do you have any questions for Dr. Daniel McCartney? Okay, so they seem to be on mute. So before we wrap up, Daniel, so one question. So for collaboration, yeah, Yogendra, please go ahead. Do you have any questions?
I have actually no question. I do work in Institute of Medicine Teaching Hospital, Kathmandu, as a head of department in the general practice MLC. We do prescribe vitamin D, but look like is working. Is some differences who taking vitamin D and who are not taking. That much idea. I enjoyed your talk programs. Just before I have another program, just let you join. I missed your talk, and
Sure.
I will see you later on. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for giving me.
Okay.
Yeah,
I mean,
so sorry for that. Because of our technical issue, we couldn't do the live from the very start. So what we'll do is we will upload Daniel's presentation. So it's a full presentation actually. So we'll upload it later on so that you can take a look at it.
It's an interesting point that Yogendra makes there about prescription of vitamin D, because I mean, certainly for people attending hospital or people attending their GP or their health center, you know, that come in contact with clinicians, we can prescribe vitamin D, but it's probably not the answer in terms of mitigating this pandemic that we're facing at the moment. It has to be an all of population intervention, where the guidance comes from public health authorities to tell people to supplement. And the reason that I say that is because we've looked at all of these different population groups, certainly in Ireland, and they're all vitamin D deficient. So one of the fallacies that prevailed, you know, before we did this work was that, you know, this isn't really an issue in younger people. And in actual fact, when we looked at the Irish population, it was the 18 to 39-year-old age group that had worse levels than anyone else, because they were the ones that were working in office jobs, that maybe didn't have as good dietary quality as their older peer groups. So this requires an all-of-population response where the public health authorities come out quite strongly and tell people that not only that they need to supplement with vitamin D, but that they need to do it in adequate doses that will protect their health, not 5 or 10 micrograms per day. That's not going to move the dial.
Yeah, I think, Dan, so the things that we discussed about, applying this at a policy level in the government basically providing a guideline for the vitamin D level. Maybe I think Yogendra is here and he would be the right person to talk to. So as he said, he and other doctors have been prescribing the vitamin D, but what you are suggesting is there should be more wider level guidance from the government.
Absolutely.
So
Needs to be policy.
that were to happen, I guess we need experts like you from outside Nepal to basically provide suggestions, your expertise on your thoughts on why that should happen. So I guess, Yogendraji, do you have any thoughts on how we can proceed this collaboration? Is there anything that we could do to basically connect with Dr. Daniel and his team, so his colleagues, to see if there is a collaboration at government level to help from here and see what we can do, not only at the prescription level, but it's more at a wider level, not only in Kathmandu or in the urban areas and the rural areas as well, and see if there is anything that can be done on the vitamin D side.
Thank you, Deficiency. We have a Nepal Health Resource Body in the Kathmandu. Everything, if you want to implement, people have to submit their profiles and their objective, what is going to benefit. Once it is approved by the Nepal Health Resource Council, they're very simple. People have to approach there, and there is luckily the secretaries are from Institute of Medicine, Pradeep Gewali. He's a very nice guy, and he's our colleagues also. And easy to meet him, and as soon as he said is very good, because in Kathmandu and most of Nepal, people are taking a vitamin D 60,000 international unit every day for 3 days. And this look like once you have COVID, we have to take 3 days continue. This is somehow following the people's, those who follow the allopathic medicines. And the people develop confidence also. You have taken vitamin D, C, zinc, multivitamins. There is no choice. You have to wait and watch. And you have to believe what is going on in the internet. And otherwise, if you have any other solution, then it's okay. Otherwise, the people are taking continue. And I think this is a good idea. If you implement from the Nepal Health Research Council, then you can easily transport the message in 77 districts of Nepal. In teaching hospital, being I am general practitioner, and we run the emergency also in Nepal. Though we have 7 PhD in emergency medicine, that's not sufficient. We had 400 general practitioners in Nepal now. Even our institute, 288 graduate, because we have to update all the information. And from general practice level, being I'm a head of department, easy to transfer message to 400 graduate. But this COVID is belong to respiratory medicine, internal medicine. They used to lead the infection related topics, and more emphasize given by the internal medicine department for them. Better is the body you can easily guide.
So you are breaking up a little bit. So you are breaking up there. So Daniel, I think Mr. Yogendra.
One more person is required for me.
Okay. So Yogendraji,
because once today is a Saturday, I have free time. Well, if so, once it is Sunday, it started, I cannot pick up the telephone. Many jobs you have to do yourself. There is less help, and Kathmandu is like very difficult to go and attend the meeting, and but definitely I can facilitate. It is very good and interesting also, because the COVID is now increasing. Today there is 1,500 cases, And
Yeah.
we have festival is also coming. Kathmandu biggest festival, Indra Jatra is coming from tomorrow. And people are not aware, and thousands of people are gathering in the city. I don't know, the result will come after 7 days, whether cases is increasing or not. Thousands and thousands of people, and we have a lot of goddess dancing programs and everything. And not aware, and
Okay.
let's see how it's gone. Just before we have less than 1,000, only 800. But suddenly the schools are opening, and all the they're open from tomorrow. Class will be going up. Hospital, our department, two people.
Yeah.
There's a here. Need IQ and ventilator. The common cases.
So there is some
5% reason behind less cases.
Right, thank you. Yeah, so sorry, Yogendraji. So you are breaking up a little. I think that we have some network issue there. So Daniel, I think so. What you were proposing last time about collaborating with doctors in Nepal, I think Mr. Yogendra, he is the right contact point. So he is in Institute of Medicine in Nepal. So that is the most biggest institute. That's a central medical institute in Nepal. So that's the point of contact. So if you contact there, if you collaborate with the doctors there, so you can have access to the rest of the country, as well as Mr. Yogendra Shrestha Sake mentioned just now. And also he about the National Health Research Center, NHRC. That is where you submit a proposal. If we need more information about this later on, we can get in touch with Mr. Yogendra Sake and take his help. So it looks like I think we have a right path here. So if we want to take this collaboration about vitamin D further, I think we can do that. And hopefully Dr. Yogendra Sake here, and he will be able to help. So Yogendraji, if you could kindly send your email to nepalirelandsociety@gmail.com. nepalirelandsociety@gmail.com. If you just could drop a quick email so that we have your email address, we'll contact.
Just write down.
Yeah, it is one word: nepalirelandsociety@gmail.com. I will put you in contact with Dr. Daniel McCartney here, and so see what we can do. Like if there is something that we can come up with regarding, okay, yashake@yahoo.com. I can see there now. Thank you very much. I will drop you an email and then see how we can collaborate and take this further. So Daniel, do you have any particular question for Dr. Yogendra here?
No, I mean, I think it's interesting. I wasn't able to hear some of what Dr. Shaki was saying, but what I did hear was, you know, in relation to the various sort of authorities that are charged with policy development around this area. Yeah. And I mean, that's the important thing, that this data and these research findings are translated into action in terms of policy development and clinical practice guidelines. I just make a couple of other points maybe before we finish, that the solution, the medium to long-term solution here, well, long-term probably, is to add this to food. Supplementation is a stopgap because we have to do something now, because there's thousands of people dying from COVID that could have their circumstances and their outcomes significantly enhanced by getting their vitamin D status up quickly. So we have to supplement, but the long-term solution to vitamin D depletion and deficiency around the world are for governments to commit to food fortification policies where this gets added into staple foods in a mandated way at national level. The other thing that I didn't mention during our talk here is, because children are often sort of only discussed in secondary terms in relation to the COVID pandemic, it's been much more serious across the adult population, particularly older adults. But children are affected And there is a recent meta-analysis that was published in the Quarterly Journal of Medicine that shows us that for vitamin D deficient children, now remember, we saw data here from Nepal that says that about 90% of those rural children had levels less than 15 nanomoles per liter. And what this meta-analysis or systematic review told us very clearly was that for children that are vitamin D deplete, they're about 5.6 times more likely to have a severe outcome to their COVID-19 infection or their COVID-19 disease. So that's significant because those children may ultimately live long-term with health legacy issues that have been precipitated by their COVID-19 disease. So it's worth thinking about from a national point of view as well. It's not just the adults that we need to think about here. The children need to be part of our consideration as well, even though they're not as severely affected in most instances by COVID-19. You're muted, Deepesh.
Okay. Thanks, Daniel. Sorry, so I was on mute there. Let me just do one thing there. Yeah. So thanks for your time today. It's really wonderful. So even though I'm not from the medical background, so it's I could understand.
Good, excellent. That was the objective.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's wonderful. It means vitamin D is obviously in Ireland, especially in Ireland, so that the data that you gave from the immigrant population here, 93%, more than 93% have deficiency of vitamin D. That's alarming. And of course, with this COVID-19 issue that's ongoing in the world, it's not something that you should take it lightly. And as your data and as your papers, as your research suggested that the deficiency of vitamin D is definitely something that could highly impact if you are affected by COVID-19. So now coming back to our initial talk regarding collaboration in Nepal. So what we can do from here, and maybe what we can like learn from Nepal, right? So as Dr. Yogendra mentioned earlier, that the people in Nepal are taking vitamin D on a regular basis. So maybe if we can get some of those data, and maybe we can form some sort of a team for collaboration between the yourself and your colleagues and some other doctors or medical professionals who are interested, and also we get people from Nepal like Mr. Dr. Yogendra here and his colleagues. We can form some sort of a committee, a collaboration group, and then we can take this forward. So it will take time. I don't think it's going to happen today, tomorrow. Despite the busy schedule here and there comes into play, but I can see the path how we need to approach it. So one thing I would like to mention here is we have Ireland-Nepal Parliamentary Friendship Group, and we have Nepal-Ireland Parliamentary Friendship Group in Nepal as well. And from when it was established in 2017, we had set up a health committee, and from HSC, Dr. David Wickleham, he went to Nepal to study possible opportunities, possible sectors that we could collaborate on the health sector. So that was part of the Ireland-Nepal Parliamentary Friendship Group initiative. I think this initiative can be included as part of that that initiative from the friendship group as a whole. Maybe we could discuss about this
what's that doctor's name, Deepesh?
Dr. David Wickleham. He is in HSC. Wickleham, yeah. And maybe I could get you in touch with him. So that's something that we could cover there too. Yeah. All right. I think with that, we will wrap up today's program. So we had two back-to-back chats. We couldn't go live with Mike O'Shea because of some technical issue, and with Dan's presentation, we couldn't go live, but we will upload the presentations and the talk later on once we have done the necessary edits. And I would like to thank Patrick for hosting today's program, and in a short notice and with other tasks that he has in hand, he has kindly accepted to join the call today and host the chat program. So really appreciate Patrick and Daniel, really wonderful. So your proactive initiative here is wonderful. I'm pretty sure that if we could take this forward in some action-oriented way, I think it would help save a lot of lives, basically.
Indeed, that's the objective.
So, and thanks Dr. Yogendra Mansaki and Dr. Soni Shrestha for joining today. Your input is very valuable. Please do be in contact with us. Our email, I said, is nepalirelandsociety@gmail.com. I can see there is opportunity of collaborations, even in this, and not only this, the vitamin D for COVID-19 pandemic, but for other health-related opportunities. Since Ireland, UK is pretty much in the same region, I think we can form a collaborative team between the two countries and see what we can do between Ireland, Nepal, UK, and maybe some other European countries as well, as a whole, as a team. Right, and thanks to Yogendraji for your input. And definitely, I think if this is to be taken further, if we are to take more actions and more a project type way in future, I think your help and support will be key here, right? And you joining today is really helpful. I can see Dr. Soni, I see you raised hands. Did you have any questions before we wrap up?
Not the question, because this is for the first time I came to know about this program, and I could be, it's my pleasure that I could be the part of this. The only thing lastly I would like to say, no matter where we're from, no matter where we work, as the end is our goal, our aim is to save lives. So please let me know if I could be any useful for the project or the program. That will be my pleasure. That's the only thing I would like to say. And thank you so much for everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you. All right, that's great. Thank you. So with that, we will wrap up today's program. So Patrick, did you have anything to say before we wrap up?
Thanks, Deepesh. No, just to say thank you to Daniel for his presentation. That was very interesting and very thought-provoking. So thanks very much. Great to hear about the work.
Delighted to do it, Patrick. Delighted to do it.
That's great. Thanks, Daniel. Thanks for your time today. Have a nice weekend.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Deepesh. Thanks, Patrick. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Yeah.